Welcome to the Birkbeck Thinks podcast, a series of conversations between Birkbeck academics, our friends, students and alumni, addressing some of the questions behind our research and offering a window into life at Birkbeck. Today I'm here with Dr. Sophia Connell and Dr. Simon Pooley to talk about their fascinating work in animal studies and environmental studies, and the teaching we do at Birkbeck in these areas. I'm Anna Richards, and my research is at the intersection between critical animal studies and literature, and in particular on the relationship between feminism and animal rights in the novel. Sophia is a philosopher with a particular interest in Aristotle, and Simon is a geographer and a conservationist who works on and with crocodilians. Sophia and Simon, could you perhaps please each say something about your work on animals and the environment? Sophia?
I mainly work on Aristotle's zoology, which he considered to be a key part of his philosophical program and included very in-depth study of non-human animals. And I believe this provides an understanding of the importance of animals in the history of Western philosophy and a different perspective for us on animal rights and environmental goods today. Often in the history of Western philosophy, Aristotle is seen as a villain for his account of how animals, non-human animals, are for the sake of humans. That's one line in his work, The Politics. But that's a very particular account from a very particular work, and people don't understand is that he also wrote very detailed treatises on animals from their own point of view. And he didn't think there is this sort of dominion model of human beings having the right to use animals and the natural environment to the full extent that they wish. That's not the picture that he puts forward. He's very interested in the goods of animals and our relationship with animals and the respect that we should have for them because of their emotional capacities, their intelligence. And he's also got this awareness of the powerful forces of the natural world that human beings shouldn't attempt to completely control.
Good, thank you. Fascinating. Simon?
Hi, I work on human-wildlife interactions, mainly those of the dangerous kind, with the aim, I suppose, of saving lives, human and those of the other animals involved in these. So I work across a range of disciplines. I come from an environmental humanities background and social sciences, but I've had extended immersions in natural science environments, and I've done a lot of field work in different parts of the world. And the aim is to kind of widen the aperture of the traditional approach in conservation, which has been impact-focused and conflict-oriented. So considering the nature of other living beings, their capacities, their well-being, their ethical standing, haven't really been incorporated, I think, thoroughly into the conservation mainstream. Animals often remain objects of conservation efforts. So I'm interested in discovering in what ways particular communities of humans and animals have learned to coexist in their shared landscapes. And that raises difficult questions for conservation, thinking around how do you work, what scale do you work at population scale, do you work at individual scale? And that's in terms of the people you're interacting with as well as the animals. I would say my work is not mainstream in terms of animal studies, particularly because animal studies on the whole have focused not on wild animals. They've focused closer to home on pets, on livestock, on zoo animals, which in a way is kind of anthropocentric, I would say. There are, of course, lots of exceptions. I won't go into them now. But if you interpret animal studies widely enough, there's, historians, Harriet Ritvo, Mark Barrow, Sandra Swart, anthropologists like my friends Gary Marvin, Kate Hill, Jamie Lorimer, the geographer. There's some very interesting environmental philosophers, David Abrams and Val Plumwood. And, of course, hardcore ethologists also try and apply what they've learned about animal behavior. Another friend of mine, Josh Plotnick, works on Asian elephants, Harry Green on reptiles, the late Frans de Waal on apes, have used that knowledge and thought about how that applies to how we have relationships with animals.
Fascinating, thank you. And you both sort of referenced briefly there the idea of animals for their own sake. Simon and Sophia, you talked about the emotional capacities of animals, and that was really what my next question was about. So I think your work has in common an attempt to expand the bandwidth of our understanding of the cognitive abilities and the emotions, in other words, the inner lives of non-human animals, including, of course, those such as reptiles, crocodiles, who seem very distant from us. Sophia, could you say a bit more about Aristotle's conception of animals' inner lives, and perhaps, given what modern science has told us, about how accurate his work has turned out to be?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to respond to one thing that Simon just said about the wild animals not being included so much in animal studies, and it really struck me as interesting because Aristotle treats wild animals as well as domesticated animals, and he uses both to try and find out about the internal life of animals. And he may even be the first ethologist because he studied animals in their natural environment and very carefully took note of how they were negotiating the environments around them and conspecifics, and how they were interacting with one another, how they were communicating with each other. In the way he would, I think Aristotle's view is helpful because there's been this debate in contemporary theory of animal minds in philosophy between those who say when we impute emotions or intelligence to animals, we're just being anthropocentric. They don't really have those qualities. We're just projecting them from our human point of view. And those who say, but if you take everything away from them, you do something like anthropodectomy. You make it so that they have nothing in common with humans. And people like famous philosophers like Kant and Descartes thought of animals as purely mechanical, just like machines. They didn't have any inner life. And I think that there was in the 20th century an overuse of the idea of instinct to cover everything. The animal never sort of makes any decision for itself. Aristotle doesn't have any concept of instinct, and instead he says that animals have memory, foresight. They carefully plan and respond to their environments and to particular circumstances that they've never met before. They learn from new circumstances. One striking example he has is of a deer. He says the deer brings its young close to the roads because it's learned that human beings go down the roads and the wild animals that predate the young stay away. And so that deer is adapting its behavior, learning from a new environment that's been brought in by people living nearby. The other striking thing is that he talks about animals learning from each other, the way that they train their own young, and they can't actually have their own way of life and way of being without being trained by an older member of their kind. And this means if you wanted to bring an animal back from extinction, like the de-extinction project, this is not really possible because you don't have any adult animals there to train the animal to live its way of life. This was recognized by Aristotle. And this ability to train, for animals to train each other, which is part of how they come to understand their environments, it also explains how human beings can train animals, because they are using those same capacities when they train and tame animals. So the only other thing I guess I'd say is that although he thinks we have a lot in common with other animals, and other animals can be intelligent, he has a way of explaining how human intelligence differs. Human beings have even more flexibility about how they organize their lives, and they can put in place practical reasoning. They have to put in place practical reasoning. They aren't given the sort of capacities to reason to immediate ends. And that's why non-human animals can't have complete virtue and happiness, according to Aristotle. But on the other hand, they can't be vicious and evil.
And Simon, could you tell us a bit more perhaps about the emotional lives of reptiles and crocodiles?
Not a phrase you hear often. Yeah, I'd love to. So essentially a depressing number of humans harbour a deeply ingrained prejudice against reptiles and have very low expectations of their capacities. And the science to dispel these harmful myths has been really slow in coming for some of the same reasons. So when my dad, Tony, shared his findings on maternal care in the Nile crocodile in the 1970s, he was met with complete incredulity. And fortunately, the BBC came out, National Geographic, Time Life, came out and filmed this because no one could believe this. This was surely a mistake. So I was definitely aware of this kind of prejudice growing up. The assumption generally, and I would say this is still largely the case, is that reptiles are dull, slow, solitary. They have tiny primitive brains and simple behaviors. You probably all know this mythical triune brain model where the human mind has a vestigial primitive reptilian brain region down in the basement which controls the automatic basic functions. This is an outdated idea of this sort of almost great evolutionary chain of progress from simple reptile intelligence up, ascending through to the mammals and, of course, the acme, us. So this is the idea. There is only one sort of kind of intelligence, and it's evolved into us. More recently, we've begun to understand there are fundamentally different kinds of intelligence, for instance, cephalopods. So these kind of powerful prejudices have meant there's loads of research on mammals and birds. We like those. Even though there are more described species of reptiles than any other group of tetrapods. And why is this? So we are a little frightened of some of them. They're hard to study. So lots of them live in habitats that are uncomfortable for us. They might be nocturnal. And we can't read their emotions. We're not good at understanding their emotions, so we assume they don't have any. But there's a new kind of wave of reptile behavior research in this century, and it's revealing a staggering range of social behaviors. So there's communications, including embryo to embryo communication, the vocalizations on and under the water, there's use of infrasound. Many reptiles are caring parents. They collaborate socially. They construct communal homes. There are long-lived family groups cohabiting. This it's facilitated by recognition of family members, kin recognition, so individuals. And of course, there are a lot of advantages like group vigilance and cooperative hunting to doing this. Their styles of reproductive behavior are really varied. So from the sort of harem system that we know with a big stag and, with some females, there's that. And there's also long-term monogamy in the reptile world. Their courtships can be very extended. Crocodiles have probably the most complex breeding behavior in the animal kingdom. They produce a wide range of vocalizations. They use infrasound. So they use infrasound to create this dancing droplets effect above their back in the water. It's quite a display. They use head slaps, jaw slaps. They have distinctive bodily postures. During courtship, they produce odors from glands. They have elaborate sequences of signaling, posturing, rubbing, maneuvering to solicit or signal availability for mating. It's very gentle, these very large reptiles. There's also evidence of play behavior, certainly in captive crocs, and social learning. So Sawa Mukherjee, an Indian researcher and croc and snake guys, reckons you can teach a crocodile to do anything. You can teach a performing seal to do, and better than that, it's done with a reward, often a dominant croc, but the other crocs can learn just by watching how to do this because they see they're going to get the payoff and then they've learned what to do. So basically, we're just bad at reading reptile social signals, or most of them. An example is the big fearsome Komodo dragon. If it's got a partially raised stiffened tail, that means it's irritated or, on the other hand, feeling threatened. So it's trying to tell you this, right? It's saying, back off. And if you ignore that, well, then perhaps you'll end up in a worse situation. But it's kind of signaling this, crocodiles arch their backs typically in the water if they want you to back off. So they're trying to tell you. Of course, some reptiles have evolved very clear signals intended for hominids because hominids interfere with them, particularly snakes. So Harry Green has done some very interesting work on this. So snakes have a wide variety. So rattlesnakes rattle, puff adders puff, cobras display their hoods. That's for us. That's saying back off, buddy. Spitting cobras spit. Okay, that's a little bit more aggressive, but it's to make hominids go away. And often snake bites by venomous species are what they call dry bites. It's a warning bite. Because if it does inject you with venom, that's really serious. But what it's saying is, if you don't leave me alone, I'm going to bite you. So yeah, there is a whole emotional world of reptiles of which we are almost entirely ignorant.
Yeah.
But it's there, and we're just pushing into this territory now.
And I think a lot of what you've said will be very new to people, and that absolutely we assume from the way animals and reptiles in particular behave that there's not a whole lot going on beneath the surface, and you've made very clear that that's very inaccurate. And I find that a lot of the time when people are arguing for to elevate the moral standing of animals or for improvements in animal welfare or animal rights, they focus on mothering and parenting behaviour. And I think you both mentioned that. You talked, Sophia, about animals training their young, and Simon, you talked about maternal care and crocodiles and caring parents. And I wonder why this seems to be the place often that human and non-human species meet, and whether we need to recognise these kind of similarities with animals in order to be more motivated to improve their lives. I guess that's related to what you were saying, Sophia, about anthropomorphizing animals, whether we need to do that in some sense. And it's our inability or the difficulty with which we do that for reptiles, which has been the hindrance there. Have you found something similar, that there's often this kind of reference to mothering and so the altruism of mothering?
Yes, I think in my work I was really struck by the fact that Aristotle connects intelligence with care for the young, so that in his zoological treatises he often talks about the intelligence of female animals, and as we know, he didn't talk about that kind of thing with reference to humans. He would be more likely to denigrate women's abilities, but in the zoological context it's mostly the female animals who are the intelligent ones and the ones who are adapting to raise their young in straitened circumstances. And then if we go back to his work on human beings, he does connect being ultra-social with intelligence, and thinks maybe that in the human context it's men who take over the roles of educating the young. But he's got this deeply biological view. He famously says that human beings are political animals. So he's connecting us back to our animal part of us. And I think that's partly in contrast to what Plato sometimes does, which is to think, to discourage us from certain behaviors by saying that they're beastly, or they're the kind of behaviors that we would normally find in disgusting animals, which is part of the legacy of what Simon mentioned about certain animals being ones that we wouldn't consider to be good animals. They're bad animals and they don't have any feelings. But Aristotle extends this study of animals to all of the ones that were traditionally considered to be lowly. He said they are just as important to carefully observe those kinds of animals. But back to your question, Anna, it sadly seems that even though we are aware of the emotions and suffering of domesticated animals, particularly farm animals, it still seems pretty easy in a fragmented and industrial system to not really take their suffering into account, for example, in taking the young away from animals in industrial farming. So I think it's important to think of the salience and proximity and experience of actual animals, say maybe thinking about your own cat or dog, when you then say, well, those experiences, or also other animals have the same experiences, and we maybe should treat them with the same kind of respect that we treat our companion animals.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I would completely agree. And the classic thing to say is, you're cold-blooded. There's the classic Gary Larson cartoon where the crocodile's in the dock on court, and he says to the judge, well, of course I did it in cold blood, you idiot. But it's a sort of synonym with unfeeling and all the rest of it. So yeah, on parenting, a wide range of reptiles, from alligators to rattlesnakes, are caring parents, and most people simply don't know this. They parent, some of them communally, So both parents can care for it's not only the mums. They have communal creches. They live together in family groups. Mother crocodiles of some species, I mean, they spend literally months guarding their nests. They don't eat at all during that period of time. They help regulate the temperature. It's quite a big sacrifice for them, and they will guard their hatchlings fiercely. As I mentioned, my dad, Tony, got interested in crocs as a young field ranger, so in what's now KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. And he thought, in fact, one of the Zulu field rangers played a trick on him and knew he was interested in birds and gave him a crocodile egg and asked him what bird had laid this egg. And they all laughed themselves silly because my father was guessing all these birds. And then he decided to try and look up a little bit more about the crocodiles and realized there was very little. So he collected a clutch and he hatched them out and he studied. That's how he began with his croc studies. And he observed adult crocs in the wild for years. And then later in captivity, he set up a research station to restock wild populations which were being decimated for the fashion leather industry at that time. But he did an experiment with a female called Mary. You're not supposed to name individual experiment animals, but Dad named all of them. He said they all had their own personalities. This was Mary. And she looked after a clutch which hadn't hatched, so they were infertile. And he played at the fence recordings of yelping babies, and she came charging over. And he had a bucket of hatchlings, because no one had actually observed this behavior in the wild. He'd been studying them for years and years and years, but just never saw it. So the standard myth, even by other game rangers and scientists, was that crocodiles ate their babies. And that turns out probably to be because people had seen what happens. What really happens is hatchlings start yelping underground in their eggs. Mother comes, uncovers them, digs them out, and then they switch their tails and yelp, and then she picks them up in her mouth, and she's got like a handbag under her jaws, and she pops them in there until she's got a handbag full, and then she takes them down to the river and deposits them in a safe nursery area that she's chosen for them. And people had presumably seen this and concluded the evil crocodile was eating its babies. Of course, you don't get to survive for millions of years if you eat your babies, but nevertheless, the prejudice was so strong that this was the assumption. And what Dad realized was that he could shift the image of crocodiles, because the only time they ever showed up in popular culture and media was as frightening, cold-blooded killers. It's the only time you ever heard about crocodiles. So if he could make the story about this caring parent, this could really change the narrative. And one of the first wildlife documentaries shown on South African Broadcasting Corporation in South Africa featured Dad's work, and he included the sequence, and he had these babies, these hatchlings. And the soundtrack was really important. So they played the typical sort of soundtrack appropriate for boisterous children, instead of the usual frightening, threatful Jaws soundtrack that you always hear with crocodiles. And I think there was a lot of media interest in this at the time, and it did actually shift the dial on how people saw crocodiles. So just to close the thought, I think there is definitely something about that shared experience of parenting and affectionate amusement at the antics of, young animals and children fumbling about and doing silly stuff that allows fellow feeling, even with crocodiles.
I'm intrigued by your father naming all the experimental crocodiles, and that isn't normally done, and that leads me to think a little bit about not just about animals for their own sake and their relationships with one another, but also relationships between human and non-human animals. And I think you've done some work of your own, Simon, on the relationships between human and non-human animals in India, mugger crocodiles and human local inhabitants. And I wondered if you could say a bit more about this and human-animal relationships more generally, and whether it tends to be a question of necessity, of sharing the same habitats, or whether, it's quite evident that we get a lot out of our relationships with animals. You talked about Sophia, our pets, our cats and our dogs, and that's enormously enriching for us. Do animals want to be friends with us? Did Mary want to be friends with your dad? Did Mary and your dad have any kind of recognition of one another or a relationship, or was she just focused on the babies that were arriving?
Yeah, that's interesting. So there definitely are those personal relationships. So one of the things that happened at that time was that any crocodile that was a threat to human life or livestock was killed, partly because there was nothing, what were you going to do if you caught a big crocodile? So he set up a research center and he used captured crocodiles as breeding stock for the restocking program, but it also meant some large ornery crocodiles had somewhere they could go where they wouldn't be killed. And there was a infamous crocodile called Mainkainkai who was caught, who'd worked out that at Mainkainkai's crossing, named after a local Tonga chief, there was this place where people could cross the river, and he'd worked out that this was fast food joint. I mean, he just would, if he was hungry, he just went there, and there was either people or donkeys crossing and, lunch. And so they decided this could not be. So he captured Mainkainkai, and he was a big, robust crocodile, not very pleased about being caught. But Dad always handled the crocodiles himself. He always released them. So the releasing is tricky. You have to secure the jaws, and then you have them in the trap, and you bring them inside the capture area, and then you have to unsecure the jaws. But Dad had this thing about being gentle with animals. And I've seen, to this day, so many sort of croc capture crews being very robust with crocodiles. And they always pose with 6 of them sitting on its back. And it's very silly. A crocodile's just much bigger and stronger than you. So the whole macho thing about this, and sort of really use the word manhandling these animals, and it's unnecessary and it's frightening. Dad was very gentle, and anyway, Mainkainkai, within a week of, he got the sulks, but after about a week he realized he was getting food. Actually, this was fine, and he turned out to be a complete sweetheart. But he came only for Dad. So Dad had a whistle that he did, and Dad would whistle and he'd come out to see. And lots of people tried to do the whistle and all sorts of things, ignored them entirely and completely. And decades later, after he'd gone, he came, visited Mainkainkai and whistled, and he came straight out to see him. But I'd say, relationships between humans and non-humans, particularly when those are dangerous animals, are very complicated. We know that some crocodiles have developed very close personal bonds, either with local communities. You can see hair-raising clips on YouTube of Indonesian villagers patting and feeding very large wild saltwater or estuarine crocodiles. For those of us who study these animals and the attacks, it's totally frightening, but something's going on there. The most famous example was the 20-year-long relationship between a very big American crocodile called Pocho and a Costa Rican man called Gilberto Chito Shedden. And this crocodile had been shot, it was relatively young, in the head. And he rescued it and nursed it back to health. And they had a lifelong close relationship. I mean, there's loads of footage. There's a very nice film about it. But, they literally play. He would roll the croc around. The croc would nudge him, would come and sleep outside his house. This went on for 20 years. There was something specific here. In the US, people have, in Florida, they have comfort gators who do, give people hugs and make them feel better. And they basically do the same thing dogs do in this respect. None of this is typical, but it shows what's feasible. It shows the bandwidth is much wider, vastly wider than we suspect that it is. So, crocs learn to recognize individual humans and react appropriately. So one of my croc specialist group colleagues, Mauricia Teles, she's in Belize, says they learn about the catchers. So they learn the sound of their vehicle. So if they hear the vehicle coming down that caught some of them before, they're gone. The catchers themselves try and wear different outfits. They wear hats because the crocs, when they see them, they know time to scarper. They're coming for us. Some farms use sort of colored overalls to tell the crocs what's going to happen next. So they know, okay, cutting the grass, get in the water, or cleaning the water, get out onto the grass. When you hold a crocodile, those of us who have, be gentle. What are you trying to do? And you can really know. I've literally been holding a gator that was being tagged and passed it to someone else who was nervous and grabbed it very firmly, and immediately it started struggling because it was worried. It felt this person was, something intense was going on. So they're sensitive to how we behave towards them. All of this said, absolutely do not cozy up to wild crocodiles or snakes with whom you have no prior relationship. As you say, I did this work on coexistence in the wetlands of Gujarat. There are certainly communities of humans and crocs that have learned over many generations to share common water sources peaceably. Even then, sometimes accidents happen. It's a large predator. You stand on it in dirty water, you will get bitten. So, yeah.
And the people who you were describing who do have friendlier or more intimate relationships with crocodiles and alligators, what's stopping the crocodiles or alligators in those situations not attacking them? You talked about people not being frightened around them, but have they just had enough to eat? Do they recognise that certain people are for eating and some people might not be for eating, or what reduces that danger?
We'd love to know. If we could just interview those crocodiles.
Yes,
I think
may help. Should we have them on next?
Food's a factor. If crocodiles are very hungry, or if we get in the water. But I think there is something about a relationship. Crocodiles have expectations of what humans, are they a threat, are they not a threat? Crocodiles in a pool with fish would rather eat fish. Less chance of getting into trouble, less chance of getting hurt. Sensible.
Yeah. And Sophia, did Aristotle have anything to say about human relationships with animals?
Yes, in fact, I was going to talk a little bit about a more general theory that he seemed to have, but it also seems to be somewhat true from what I've just been hearing, that he was... So we had this insight, which is that the affectionate relationships between animals don't stop at the species barrier. He documents quite a lot of relationships between different species of animals and care.
Fascinating.
And then, of course, he can see this happening in the wild, and that from that he assumes that there is this capacity that humans can then take advantage of to some extent, so that we can train animals to be our friends, to live with us. Either we're, like Simon was describing, sharing some natural space, having a respect for the animals in that space, but often he's also considering the animals that live with us, like dogs, and they have trust and affection. The other thing that he notes, which I saw Simon was talking about, is the specificity of the recognition and the affection. So they're going to be just particular individuals that are going to be trusted and are going to be known from a distance by non-human animals. Sometimes that'll be a human being. And this means that, of course, that we can use and manipulate animals, but we ought to do it with some respect for their own needs and capacities. And when it comes to friendship, Aristotle has a philosophy of friendship, and he, in a work called the Eudemian Ethics, he says that humans can be friends with non-humans. And I think what's marvelous about this is that he has this philosophy of friendship, which basically is that for any friendship, all friendships require mutual well-wishing. So this means you have to love another being for their own sake, and you would want them to do well, whether that benefits you or not. And that's the sort of thing that animals are feeling for us and that we feel for animals.
It strikes me that a lot of the discussions about animal welfare take place from within environmental debates. So, for example, when we talk about the need to reduce our meat consumption, that's often framed as an environmental rather than predominantly, or in the first place, an animal rights question. And I think, of course, sometimes those two interests are very clearly aligned, but actually there are often tensions, which perhaps are less discussed, between animal rights and environmental ethics. And this comes often down to the idea, on the one hand, that animals have rights as individuals, they're all equally important on the animal rights side, versus the importance, for example, of preserving biodiversity or protecting certain endangered species, perhaps protecting native populations rather than species that have been introduced by human beings. Yeah, so I wondered whether these kind of tensions ever come up in your work, and how, whether you had any thoughts about how we might resolve them or balance them.
I've thought about this, and it's very complex, and I've decided to cut the Gordian knot and just go out there on the front foot and just be controversial on this one. So I just feel sometimes when I hear these very subtle arguments on this particular question, let's put some perspective on this. About 4% of living mammals by weight are so-called wild animals. That is not us, not our pets, and not our livestock. So I'm a bit skeptical of this critique that conservation is kind of elitist or speciesist and undemocratically relegates our pets to second-class status. We have and we continue to exterminate other species not of direct use or consequence to us at industrial scale. Then we want to claim it's unfair to prioritize the survival of those that we haven't created ourselves and introduced for our own purposes into this world. Part two of this argument is that there aren't really any natural species or environments anyway, because again, we've interfered with all of them. Well, this is a very satisfactory from a human point of view, isn't it? We live in the Anthropocene, we're told it's all about us, it's all up to us. Let us decide how it should be. Well, I'd say look around and it's going well, isn't it? There's more nuance to this, which I'll talk about later, but that's something I feel inclined to say at this point.
Okay, good. Yes, thank you. Sophie, do you have any thoughts on that?
I love that. And I think these are huge and crucial questions. And I was just going to take up the other side, if that's all right.
Yes, please do.
So I think this tension has come up in the last 50 years, especially in philosophical environmental ethics, where people were looking for some kind of motivation to take care of the environment. And they went to wild places, beautiful places, awesome, charismatic megafauna. And if you can care for those, then you can care for the rest of the environment. And that's the way it was going for a while, talking about wild nature and preservation, over and above the fact that we interact with non-human animals all the time in our actual environments, and those being wild or semi-wild or feral or domesticated. And I suppose I feel as if we should include all of these animals in our concerns, and not just those that we're worried about becoming extinct. Because I also think that worry about these charismatic megafauna becoming extinct is humans projecting their own values onto nature and saying, these ones are pretty, these are amazing forms, I'd like to see them, I want them to be there. So sometimes we need to temper that. So what happened was, in the last 50 years, is then they became this focus on extending the usual human ethics, say like Kantian ethics, where you're going to consider a rational being as just as equal to you and treat it in exactly the same way. And that got extended to other animals. So everything that's sentient needs the same consideration. And then that got extended to all living beings. So everything that has a teleological center of life is to be considered morally as exactly the same as anything else. And that was called biocentrism. And the problem with that is it didn't really make any sense, because, I mean, what do we do with predation? What do we do with the fact that a flock is going to do well if the younger and weaker members get predated? We can't value every single living organism exactly the same way. What do we do about infections and parasites and so on? So that led to people wondering about the value of ecosystems and the value of, say, biological collectives like species. And as Simon mentioned, what we see is that organisms are constantly impacting each other and adapting to each other. Now, probably humans have done this more than any other organism. They are affecting other organisms and transporting them to different places. I mean, at a lower level, that happens anyway. Animals will carry burrs on their fur and pollen and so on to a different area. But our interference is at a much more problematic level. I mean, there's so many big questions here, and I just think that we need to focus on humility and respect and put aside this techno-optimism that Simon also mentioned. If it's the Anthropocene, let's just go in with all we've got and change everything to make it a human world, even more so. We have to have this, actually, we're only, if extinction leads to mass extinction event, which some predict, then we are in a very bad position biologically as human beings. So we actually need to respect the things that we can't control.
Yeah, it's interesting when you talk about sentience as one of the measures of how much moral standing someone should be accorded. And I think that's such a tricky question, because how do we, there are so many species, I think, and you both might know more about this than I do, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there seem to be so many species where we're really not sure what the science has to say about whether sentience exists or not. All the insect species, for example, and are similar. So it's perhaps that's an explanation of why this idea of biocentrism that you talked about, Sophia, gained ground, because there's a clear line there. If whether something is living or not, it's not so clear. It's not so easy to determine whether everything that's alive has sentience, has moral standing on the basis of having particular interests related to sentience. And Simon, I don't know if this is partly what you were touching upon, but could you tell us a little bit about what's called compassionate conservation, and whether or not I heard about this recently, and I wondered whether that was a sort of attempt to bridge this gap that I've identified that sometimes exists between animal rights and environmental ethics.
Wow, okay, that's risky. So this is something I would normally avoid because it's so polarized.
Okay.
Compassionate conservation is based on the ethical position that actions taken to protect biodiversity should be guided by compassion for all sentient beings. Sentience again. Conservation, therefore, should expand its moral community by recognizing all sentient beings as persons. If you're a person, in an ethical sense, then you're an individual who's owed respect and should not be treated as a means to other ends. So the kind of moral exclusion of members of other species legitimates, compassionate conservationists argue, the ongoing exploitation of the living world, and that's why we need conservation in the first place. So it's quite a powerful argument. Other conservationists have pushed back very robustly. They say being compassionate doesn't exclude, for example, humanely killing an animal. If that reduces its suffering, if that enhances the survival of the species or its habitat, if that safeguards human life or other more threatened species. The idea that it's illegitimate to kill any specific animal for conservation ends is, they say, disabling, and it ignores the lived realities of those people who have to live with dangerous animals. So compassionate conservation's focus on the fates of individual animals, I think, is an important intervention. I think it can be certainly a corrective to where there's indifference. And we've seen a lot of this in reptiles. People don't think they are individuals. They have personalities. So you really can just treat them as things. I think also widening consideration of what's valuable beyond ideas about pristine or wild landscapes, beyond only native or wild animals, is also really valuable. Just further to what we've just heard, all of the categories that we have, wild, feral, tame, different taxonomic, these are all human categories. We've just made all this stuff up and imposed it. So, and we've imposed them on living beings, all of them. But there are, on the other side, there are real implementation challenges to compassionate conservation. Like, what about the rights of local people who are living with very dangerous animals and don't want to? How do we work in landscapes where some locals say have reverence for those animals and others see them just as a dangerous threat? What about scenarios where locals identify problematic animals as supernatural animals? Now what territory are you into here? And so it seems to me there's a kind of universalizing ethical high ground being taken by compassionate conservation, which is a bit tricky when you start applying it to everyone and everything everywhere. In my experience in the croc world, if compassion requires consideration of all the actors involved in human-wildlife interactions, if it requires humane action, including if at a last resort, something like lethal control, as long as it's humanely performed, then I think compassion it's doable. It's essential. If it means every individual has an inviolable right to life, including, for example, an introduced predator threatening the existence of a native species or a croc threatening the lives of local farmers, it doesn't. It's a horrible decision, and we should have compassion for the people who have to decide sometimes whether to kill an animal. Nobody really wants to do that. Finally, as Sophia said, if we follow rights approaches to the logical conclusions, there are awkward questions around the assumed rights of prey not to be predated upon. So where do we go with this? So, I was actually just at a seminar this week by Nitin Sikar. There's a coexistence consortium, India-based. And he was talking about trade-offs, and he was questioning whether his work on capturing and tagging an elephant was a good enough trade-off because they paid the guys in meal. They had chicken meals and it's broiler chickens, and he felt guilty because this supports an industry which really maltreats these animals. They have terrible lives, and it is shocking. So what was interesting to me was, it's an India-based consortium, as one of the audience members replied that actually in India, with its dominant Hindu majority, conservationists calling for an end to meat eating because of this cruelty to animals can be seen actually as discriminatory and dismissing mostly lower caste folk who have those traditions of meat eating. So there are real complications to insisting on a universalist ethical view. I much prefer to work at a landscape and community level, and I think these things need to be negotiated, not imposed.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. That was very helpful. So I saw you were making notes. Some of that. Was there anything you wanted to say in particular in response to what Simon just said? Or
Yeah, I mean, only that I think going back to the ancient context can be helpful in this regard, that we don't want to impose a sort of contemporary philosophical general theory onto everywhere in the world. Rather, we can see in the ancient material a respect and worship of animals, and the idea that living beings have interests quite apart from our own, while also acknowledging that we need to survive on the land. In the ancient world, there was no industrialized farming, so there was always a negotiation with the wild populations around people.
And Sophie, you mentioned earlier, I think, the idea that Aristotle has, that each animal has a kind of particular way of life that accords with its kind, and that's what the animal needs then to be able to live well, for those desires or capacities to be fulfilled. And it struck me that there was a similarity between that and the capabilities approach of Martha Nussbaum, which I think, Simon, you've written about. So, yeah, I wonder if you could both or either say a little bit more about that. Are those basically the same thing?
Well, from Aristotle, we get the idea that each animal has a way of life in accord with its kind. This is not sort of scientifically viable now, as we don't think species are fixed in the way he did. But I think over the period at which there is a thriving species, a historical period at which there is a thriving species, we can think in these terms of this bios, this way of life that, and what it is basically is bringing values into nature. So rather than just describing how this animal lives in its environment, how it locates, feeds, what its social life and organization is like, how it ideally mates and constructs nests and dens and whatever, you say that those things are good for that animal. You import good and bad into the scheme. So you're breaking up the fact-value distinction. So there's this good in nature for this particular kind. It's good. They have something that makes their life go well. And I think that can be useful because now we can say there is something wrong. There's something harmful about destroying a habitat, for example. Or there is something harmful about climate change, which stresses and affects animals. There's something harmful with introducing so many sounds that the birds can't communicate with each other in the way that they would normally do. I think that, as I understand it, Martha Nussbaum's theory is derived from a neo-Aristotelianism, but it's got its own specific framework and structure, which I think that Simon can speak more about.
Yeah, no, really interesting and accords with my understanding, but I should absolutely say I'm not a philosopher at all. My understanding of Nussbaum's approach, which kind of, it's this capacities idea that you've also mentioned, that it comes in her case, I think, from Amartya Sen, actually, in some ways. But it's predicated on the idea that all humans should have the freedom to achieve well-being, and they have these 10 capabilities, which are possibilities of functioning that people have a realistic possibility of achieving, and which all humans should have the right to fulfill, should they choose to. You don't have to. Life, bodily health, integrity, the ability to sense, imagine, think, feel, apply practical reason, reflect on life, affiliate with who you want to, have concern for nature, all of these many things. An ethical approach to conservation in this context requires consideration of whether interventions will enable or interfere with people's capabilities. So extending this then to animals, the big questions for me are, how can we include animals in an ethical conservation without being limited to observing the inviolable rights of every individual animal? Because then we're stuck, we can't act. How might we be empowered to act compassionately and proactively rather than getting stuck on all the things we can't do? How can the need of certain animals, for example, to eat others, be acknowledged in a framework granting them all ethical consideration? So Nussbaum does explicitly extend the capabilities approach to a kind of more than human ethic. Basically, she argues that if we can imagine other beings as having a stake in their own existence, and therefore a capacity to be thwarted, then those beings have a claim to justice. And this approach attaches moral significance to species, as Sophia was saying, and not only to individuals. And if we're living in an age of ecocide, as some say, this extends moral consideration beyond the individual to the species, and by extension in terms of their needs to habitats. So my thinking on this is that if we look beyond solely what shouldn't be done to individual animals, we can also consider what a species-specific norm of flourishing might look like. What I mean is, what's the appropriate benchmark for judging if a member of a species has the necessary opportunities to flourish, in other words, to fulfill its capacities? And that gives us a proactive role to play, a positive role, a duty to support the capabilities of other beings, arguably, up to this minimum threshold calibrated for their species. So it's trying to offer some kind of more explicit approach. And the thing to remember here is that flourishing is about more than just the absence of pain or discomfort. So I am an advocate for human-wildlife coexistence, but what I don't mean is basic coexistence, survival. That's not enough. It needs to be more than that. That's my take on that.
Yeah, when you said that Nussbaum wrote about animals having a stake in their own existence, there was an echo there of Tom Reagan's animal philosophy, and the idea that animals that you can judge to be subjects of a life, of their own life, are the ones that deserve consideration. Yeah, that was really interesting. I wonder if finally it might be good to hear a little bit more about the teaching on animals that we do here at Birkbeck, and how some of the ideas that you talked about might be communicated to our students. I, for example, teach on a module called Climate Change Communication, which is part of our new BA Environment, Culture and Communication, and where I talk about some of the intersections and tensions between animal rights and the environment, also between environmental studies and feminism. Tell me a little bit, each of you, about what teaching you do here on animals.
I teach on a course entitled Ethics of Life and Death, Humans, Animals and the Environment, which begins with why life and death should matter to humans, why it's the basis of our ethical and moral decision-making in many respects, why we are thinking about future generations, for example, in the environmental crisis. But then it then extends into the life and death of all other organisms. And what I end up arguing in the lecture course is that we need to relearn a kind of complementarity where we value non-human animals and biological collectives, such as species and ecosystems, while also valuing human well-being. These two don't need to be at odds. And there's one area that I'm interested in is this long history of writing about care and respect for agricultural land and for animals and plants that we use and breed and adapt. These animals and plants also have lives of their own. And I think some of that understanding has been broken by many methods of industrialized farming, which is actually bad for human lives and bad for human health. And so one thing I pick up on from the ancient context is this idea of cooperative relationships between cultivated plants and humans, animals that we use for many purposes, and human beings. And there's actually a relation of justice that Aristotle and his students talk about, that there are these mutual benefits, but we need to respect one another and for animals. So animals can't treat us with justice because they don't have an understanding of it, but we need to treat them with justice. They have given us something, and we need to give them back something in return. So a good example from Aristotle's student Theophrastus is about cultivated fruit plants that have been changed over many years, say like the olive plant. Human beings care for these plants and they are fruitful, and then they give us, because we care for them, they give us their fruit. And that's like payment for the care that we've given them. I'm very interested in that, but this comes up in the lecture course, really just goes through all of the different parts of environmental ethics that I've been talking about already. It starts with the biocentric view. Tom Regan is included, Peter Singer, and then goes through to anthropocentric perspectives and indigenous perspectives, and then we have this bit about agriculture and living with the environment.
Simon.
So we have a kind of range of BSc degrees in the broader sort of environment cluster, if you like. So it ranges from geography to human geography, geography and development, and the BSc environment and sustainability. And a number of courses are either core or available to those. So in terms of what we're talking about, I teach on human-wildlife interactions, and that's mainly wildlife just to get people thinking about what this means, but also rewilding, which brings up a lot of complex ideas around what belongs and doesn't belong in landscapes, including domesticated and wild animals, domesticated and plants, even the landscape itself. So there's a lot of interesting ideas, introducing or reintroducing animals. So I talk about this in this module that we teach it's called Humans and the Environment, and it's really getting first years to start to think about their own relationship with the environment, but also different ways in which that's being conceived. And then there's a more kind of biology oriented one, more science oriented module, introducing natural environments. And the idea here is more focused on what kinds of data do we use to understand different sets of environmental problems. So I talk about human crocodilian interactions specifically, and I talk about the kinds of data we use to record attacks, outcomes, reasons for, and then some of the social science approaches as well. In my second year, I teach a core module, Managing Environments, and that's a more in-depth take on biological invasions. And we talk about species and the nature of species, and that includes diseases. We share our own bodies with diseases. Never mind, as I've learned to my cost with dengue fever. So then I teach mainly postgraduate, most of my teaching, and the kind of opening module is Environmental Science for Environmental Management. That's for MSc Environment and Sustainability students, climate change students, geography MSc, also corporate responsibility and sustainability, and we also have an MSc in sustainable cities. And we teach across a whole range of major environmental challenges that we face now in the 21st century. And in that one, in terms of animals, it's specifically biological invasions, because because we've introduced species and we've changed environments, and there are new relationships between the species that used to live there and the ones we've brought in. So it brings up a lot of, you need to understand the science, you need to understand the social science, the culture, the economics of it. I teach in depth, mainly my most sustained work on humans and animals is an option module for master's students called Global Nature Conservation. It's being taught at postgraduate the coming year, but it's open to undergrads depending on whether I can find the time to teach it twice, frankly. But that's tackling many angles, human and in terms of animal behavior, cultural dimensions, historical dimensions of these relationships. History is an important part of what I do. It explains a lot about what's going on in landscapes, both people and animals. And finally, and that's available. That course is available to those other master's programs I've already mentioned. So we have quite a range at undergrad and postgrad, I think.
Wonderful. Well, unfortunately, I think we're running out of time, so we're going to have to wrap things up. But I wanted to say thank you very much to both of you today for taking part, and it's been really fascinating to hear a bit more about your work and your thoughts on some of these very important animal and environment-related questions.
Brilliant. It's been fun.
Thank you, Anna.